January 17, 1945. Aachen, Western Germany. The snow fell in silence over the shattered city. Through the skeletal remains of what had once been Charlemagne's capital, a column of prisoners moved slowly westward, their breath forming small clouds in the frozen air. Among them walked women, 37 of them, dressed in the Feldgrau uniforms of the Wehrmacht Auxiliary Corps, their faces pale beneath wool caps dusted white with ice. They carried nothing. No weapons, no packs, no identification beyond the eagle and swastika sewn onto their sleeves. Their boots, worn thin from months of retreat, crunched through snow that had settled over rubble and the remnants of a world that no longer existed. At the roadblock, ahead stood American soldiers, young men from Iowa and Georgia and Pennsylvania, their rifles slung across their shoulders, their expressions betraying neither triumph nor cruelty, only a weary professionalism born from months of combat. As the column halted, a medical officer stepped forward, a woman in olive drab with a Red Cross armband, carrying a clipboard and a canvas medical bag. She spoke in broken German, her voice firm but not unkind. The women prisoners exchanged glances. They had been told many things about what Americans would do to captured German women. Now they would learn the truth. This was not an isolated incident. Across the collapsing frontiers of the Third Reich, as Allied armies pressed deeper into German territory, thousands of women in Wehrmacht uniforms found themselves facing American captors. What happened in those moments of surrender, in those first hours of captivity, would become one of the most misunderstood aspects of the war's final chapter, a story buried beneath layers of propaganda, assumption, and the deliberate silence of those who lived through it. The truth, as is often the case in war, was far more complex than either side could have predicted. To understand why American forces inspected German women prisoners of war with such methodical care, one must first understand what these women represented and what the Americans expected to find. By the winter of 1945, the Third Reich had mobilized virtually every able body within its shrinking borders. Women who had been gradually integrated into auxiliary military roles since 1942 now served in capacities that blurred the line between civilian and combatant. They operated anti-aircraft batteries, worked as radio operators and telegraphers, managed supply depots, served as drivers and mechanics, and staffed communication networks. The Nachrichtenfeldfern, or signal auxiliaries, numbered over 130,000 by 1944, the Flakhelferinnen, the women who assisted in operating the deadly 88mm anti-aircraft guns, numbered tens of thousands more. These women wore uniforms. They took oaths. They served within military command structures. Yet they occupied a strange legal space, neither fully military nor entirely civilian, a distinction the Nazi regime had deliberately maintained to avoid violating the spirit, if not the letter, of international law. Germany had not signed the 1929 Geneva Convention provisions regarding women in military service, and the regime maintained the fiction that these women were auxiliaries rather than soldiers, a semantic shield meant to protect them from being treated as combatants if captured. The American military, approaching this unprecedented situation, faced a practical and legal dilemma. Were these women prisoners of war, entitled to the protections of the Geneva Convention? Were they civilian detainees? Were some of them something else entirely, intelligence operatives, members of the SS, or participants in war crimes? The answer, the Americans quickly discovered, was that they were all of these things and none of them, depending on the individual. Each woman required assessment, documentation, and categorization. And so the inspections began. The German women who found themselves in American custody in those final months of the war had lived through a transformation of expectation and reality that few could have imagined when they first volunteered or were conscripted into service. In 1942 and 1943, when recruitment for women's auxiliary services reached its peak, the Nazi propaganda machine had painted a picture of noble service to the fatherland. Posters showed strong, capable women in crisp uniforms, smiling beneath the reassuring shadow of male soldiers, contributing to the defense of hearth and homeland. Service was portrayed as temporary, safe, honorable a way for German women to demonstrate their loyalty without sacrificing their femininity or placing themselves in true danger. The reality, particularly by 1944, bore no resemblance to these promises. Women stationed at anti-aircraft installations around German cities lived through the terror of Allied bombing raids, manning their positions as British and American bombers thundered overhead and the earth shook with explosions. They slept in bunkers, ate increasingly meager rations, and watched their comrades die in the firestorms that consumed Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne. Women in communications units worked 18-hour shifts as the fronts collapsed, desperately trying to maintain contact between fragmenting military units. Those stationed in the East witnessed or participated in the wholesale retreat from Soviet forces, an exodus marked by atrocity, chaos, and the complete breakdown of military discipline. By the time these women encountered American forces, they carried with them the weight of this disillusionment. More than that, they carried the accumulated terror of Nazi propaganda about what would happen if they were captured. Goebbels' ministry had spent years constructing an image of the Americans as racially mongrelized brutes, as morally degenerate criminals in uniform, as a force that would bring vengeance and violation. To German soldiers and civilians alike, the propaganda painted a picture of American captivity as a fate potentially worse than death, particularly for women. So when that medical officer stepped forward in Aachen, when she opened her canvas bag and began her examination, the German women stood frozen not just by the cold, but by the collision of expectation and reality. The inspection process itself was systematic, thorough, and by the standards of the time remarkably respectful. It proceeded in stages, each with a specific purpose, each documented in military records that would later be filed away in archives, unread for decades. First came the initial screening, conducted by American military police and intelligence officers. Names were recorded, units identified, ranks noted. The women were asked basic questions. Where were you stationed? What were your duties? When did you surrender? These interrogations, typically conducted with the assistance of German-speaking American personnel or civilian interpreters, served both practical and intelligence purposes. The Americans needed to distinguish between different categories of prisoners, auxiliary personnel, suspected intelligence operatives, potential war criminals, and civilian detainees who had been improperly uniformed. Then came the medical inspection. And here the American approach revealed something the German women had not anticipated: institutional concern for their welfare. Army nurses and female medical officers examined the prisoners for wounds, malnutrition, infectious diseases, and evidence of assault. This was not perfunctory. The American military medical corps operated under regulations that required comprehensive health assessment of all prisoners, but the examination of women received special attention. In camps and temporary holding facilities across Western Europe, female prisoners were kept segregated from male POWs, assigned female guards where possible, and processed by female medical personnel. The reasoning was threefold. First, practical. Women in Wehrmacht service had often been stationed in conditions where they had limited access to adequate medical care, particularly in the war's final chaotic months. Malnutrition was common. So was typhus, dysentery, and untreated wounds. The Americans had learned bitter lessons about the speed with which disease could spread through POW populations. Containing outbreaks required early identification. Second, legal. Proper documentation of prisoners' conditions at the time of capture provided protection. against later allegations of mistreatment. Photographs were taken, medical conditions recorded, any evidence of prior abuse or injury noted. Third, ethical. Despite the hatred that war generates, American military doctrine, rooted in both Geneva Convention obligations and American cultural values, demanded that prisoners be treated with a baseline level of human dignity. To the German women, accustomed to the harsh pragmatism of Wehrmacht logistics and the deliberate cruelty of SS methodology, this careful attention was incomprehensible. Many would later describe their confusion in the first hours of captivity. The cognitive dissonance of finding themselves treated not as enemies to be degraded, but as human beings to be processed, documented, and within the constraints of captivity, cared for. The records reveal the details. In a temporary POW collection point near Stolberg, 30 miles east of Aachen, an American captain named Eleanor Morrison, a nurse from Michigan who had landed in Normandy 2 weeks after D-Day, processed 127 German women auxiliaries in a single 48-hour period in February 1945. Her reports, filed with the 9th Army Medical Corps, noted that 73% showed signs of moderate to severe malnutrition. 41 had untreated wounds, mostly minor shrapnel injuries and frostbite, but several had serious infections requiring immediate treatment with the newly available penicillin. 16 showed evidence of sexual assault. Though Morrison noted that determining the perpetrators, whether German soldiers, SS personnel, or Soviet troops during the retreat, was impossible without extensive interrogation that fell outside her medical remit, Morrison's reports also documented something else: the women's astonishment at their treatment. She wrote, in a letter that would later be donated to the Army War College archives, about a young woman named Greya, a radio operator from Breslau, who had been retreating westward for 6 weeks. When Morrison provided her with clean clothes, a hot meal, and antibiotics for an infected leg wound, Greta wept. "She asked me why," Morrison wrote. "Why were we helping her? She said they had been told we would kill them or worse. She couldn't understand why an American nurse would treat a German soldier. This confusion, this fundamental misalignment between expectation and reality, appears again and again in both American records and in the post-war testimonies of German women POWs. The inspections were thorough, yes. They were invasive in the way that any medical examination is invasive. But they were not cruel. They were not designed to humiliate. They were, in the context of their time and place, acts of institutional bureaucracy, infused with a peculiarly American belief that even enemies possessed certain inalienable rights, a concept that seemed as alien to the products of the Third Reich as the abundance they would soon encounter. That abundance became a symbol, repeated in countless testimonies, of everything the German women had not expected about American captivity. It appeared first in the form of food. In the POW camps that were hastily established across the Rhineland in early 1945, German prisoners received rations that, while not generous by American standards, exceeded what many of them had eaten in months. White bread, real coffee, not the acorn substitute that had become standard in Germany, canned meat, chocolate bars from Red Cross parcels. The quantities were measured, regulated by Geneva Convention requirements. But to women who had been subsisting on increasingly meager Wehrmacht rations, and in the final weeks, often on whatever they could scavenge, this represented almost obscene plenty. An American sergeant named Robert Hutchins, assigned to guard duty at a women's POW facility near Recklinghausen, wrote to his family in Ohio about watching German women prisoners receive their first hot meal in American custody. "They ate slowly," he wrote, "like they couldn't believe it was real." One of them, an older woman who'd been an Army nurse, told our interpreter that she hadn't seen real butter in 2 years. She cried when she tasted it. "I don't know what to make of that. We were bombing their cities to rubble, and she cries over butter. The food represented more than mere sustenance. It symbolized the vast material gulf between American and German war-making capacity, a gulf that had determined the war's outcome as surely as any battle. By 1945, the United States was producing more food, more weapons, more of everything than the rest of the world combined. American soldiers complained about their rations. German soldiers would have considered those same rations a feast. This disparity extended to every aspect of military life. American POW camps, while far from comfortable, had access to medical supplies, clean water, and sanitation facilities. They were heated, after a fashion. Guards were generally well-fed, well-equipped, and under orders to treat prisoners according to established regulations. The German women noticed these details. They noticed that American guards, even when bored or resentful of their assignments, rarely displayed the casual cruelty that had been routine in Wehrmacht operations. They noticed that American female personnel nurses, administrators, Red Cross workers moved with a confidence and authority that would have been impossible in German military culture. They noticed that when they were transported between facilities, it was in trucks with covered beds, not in open railway cars. Small mercies, perhaps, but to people who had spent years in a society organized around hierarchy, racial supremacy, and the deliberate infliction of suffering on designated enemies. These small mercies accumulated into a profound realization. The Americans did not need to be cruel, because they had already won. The inspections revealed other truths, darker and more complex. Among the German women processed by American forces were members of the Self-Erinnerungskorps, the women's SS auxiliary, who had served at concentration camps and execution sites. American intelligence officers, working with information provided by resistance groups and defecting German officials, maintained lists of camps and facilities where war crimes had occurred. When women prisoners were identified as having served at places like Ravensbrück or Bergen-Belsen, or the network of subcamps scattered across occupied territory, they were segregated from regular POWs and held for war crimes. Investigation. The evidence-gathering process was painstaking. Female interrogators, often Jewish refugees who had escaped Germany before the war and now returned as American military personnel, conducted interviews. Documents were collected, preserved, catalogued. Witnesses were sought. The Americans approached this work with a prosecutorial thoroughness that reflected both their legal culture and their determination to document Nazi crimes with irrefutable evidence. Unlike the Soviet approach, which often resulted in summary execution of suspected war criminals, the American method emphasized procedure, evidence, and eventual trial. Not all the German women held for investigation were guilty of direct crimes. Many had been clerks, administrators, support personnel who had worked in the bureaucratic apparatus that enabled atrocity, but had not themselves pulled triggers or operated gas chambers. The Americans struggled with this distinction, with the question of where guilt began and ended in a system organized around industrialized murder. The answer, worked out over months and years of tribunals and trials, was necessarily imperfect. But the very attempt to make such distinctions, to weigh evidence and assign individual responsibility, marked a fundamental difference in approach, a reflection of legal and cultural values that the Third Reich had explicitly rejected. For the German women who found themselves subject to these investigations, the experience was often more psychologically devastating than the initial capture. Confronted with documented evidence of what had been done in the camps, forced to acknowledge their proximity to crimes they had perhaps suspected, but deliberately ignored, many broke down. American interrogators documented cases of women who insisted they had not known, who claimed they had only followed orders, who argued that their roles had been minor and administrative. Some of these claims were true. Many were not. The Americans, products of a culture that valued individual moral agency, even as it recognized the power of institutional pressure. Found it difficult to accept ignorance or obedience as complete EXEULPATION. As winter gave way to spring, and the war ground toward its conclusion, the flow of German women into American captivity increased. By May 1945, when the surrender finally came, tens of thousands of women auxiliaries had been processed through the inspection and documentation system. The vast majority, after initial screening and medical evaluation, were classified as civilian internees rather than POWs, legal distinction that reflected their ambiguous status, but practically made little difference to their daily lives. They were held in camps, fed, given basic medical care, and gradually repatriated to whatever remained of their homes. For many, repatriation meant confronting a Germany that no longer existed. The women who returned to the Soviet zone found themselves under suspicion of collaboration, their service in Wehrmacht auxiliaries marking them as potential enemies of the new regime. Those who returned to the Western zones found cities in ruins, families dispersed or dead, and an economy that would take years to rebuild. Some chose to remain in displaced persons camps rather than return to the devastation. Others, particularly those from the former Eastern territories now absorbed into Poland or the Soviet Union, had no homes to return to. The American inspection system, thorough as it was, could not resolve these larger tragedies. What it did accomplish was more modest but not insignificant. It established a record. The photographs, medical reports, interrogation transcripts, and camp rosters created a documentary foundation that would serve multiple purposes in the post-war years. They provided evidence for war crimes tribunals. They offered a basis for claims and counterclaims about treatment of POWs. They documented the final disintegration of the Nazi military system. And perhaps most importantly, they preserved the individual stories of women who might otherwise have vanished into the chaos of collapse and defeat. Among the possessions cataloged during the inspection process, one item appears with remarkable frequency in American records: photographs. German women auxiliaries carried photographs of families, of comrades, of themselves in better times. These small images, often creased and worn from months in pockets and packs, represented connection to a world that was rapidly disappearing. American personnel processing prisoners were instructed to confiscate any photographs that might have intelligence value images, showing military installations, equipment, or personnel, but personal photographs were typically returned or at least recorded. One such photograph, preserved in the National Archives, shows a young woman in the uniform of the Nachrichtenfeldfern, standing in front of a radio transmitter somewhere in France. Circa 1943, she is smiling, confident, her uniform crisp. The future still a thing to be anticipated rather than feared. On the back, in fading pencil, someone has written the name Ilse and a date. The photograph was confiscated from a prisoner at a collection point near Koblenz in March 1945. The woman in American custody looked nothing like the girl in the photograph. 2 years had aged her a decade. The confidence was gone, replaced by exhaustion and fear. But she had carried the image through the retreat, through the collapse, through the final surrender, a talisman of a self she might once have been. The Americans who processed these women, who conducted the inspections and filed the reports, carried their own photographs, their own talismans. Letters from home, pictures of sweethearts and families, snapshots of life before the war. They too were far from home, caught in the machinery of a conflict not of their making. Yet there remained between captor and captive a gulf that no shared humanity could entirely bridge. The gulf between the defeated and the victorious. Between those who had served a regime built on racial supremacy and mass murder, and those who had fought to destroy it. Still, in the mundane interactions of the inspection process, the medical examinations, the documentation, the distribution of rations, something unexpected occasionally emerged. Not friendship, exactly, and certainly not forgiveness, but a recognition of common humanity that the war had tried to extinguish. An American nurse treating a German woman's infected wound. A bored guard sharing a cigarette. An interrogator who, after hours of questioning, would simply listen as a prisoner talked about her children, her home, her fear of what came next. These moments did not redeem the past. They did not erase the crimes of the regime these women had served. But they suggested the possibility of a future different from the cycle of vengeance that had consumed Europe for generations, a future built not on the deliberate infliction of suffering but on the slow, imperfect work of reconstruction, accountability, and eventual reconciliation. The inspections themselves became a kind of mirror, reflecting back to both sides truths they had not expected to confront. For the Americans, the encounter with German women posed complicated, simplistic narratives of total evil. These were not monsters, not abstractions, but ordinary people who had made choices, some coerced, some willing, that had led them into the service of a monstrous regime. How to hold them accountable while recognizing their humanity. How to punish guilt without creating new cycles of grievance. These questions would occupy Allied authorities for years, and the answers would never be entirely satisfactory. For the German women, the inspections forced a confrontation with realities the propaganda had systematically obscured. The Americans were not the degenerate brutes of Goebbels' imagination. They were organized, efficient, and within the constraints of a military system bound by rules that acknowledged prisoner rights. The abundance the Americans displayed was not a fiction, but a fact, evidence of a productive and organizational capacity that made the Reich's own war economy look makeshift by comparison. And perhaps most unsettling, the Americans' adherence to legal procedures and documentation suggested that the regime these women had served, the regime that had told them it represented order and civilization, had in fact been a negation of both. This realization came slowly, if it came at all. Cognitive dissonance is not easily overcome, particularly when accepting the truth requires confronting one's own complicity. Many German women held by American forces would spend the rest of their lives negotiating between what they had been told, what they had experienced, and what they could bear to acknowledge. Some would embrace the denazification process, would attempt to build new identities as citizens of a democratic Germany. Others would retreat into selective memory, would insist that they had been victims too, would minimize or deny their participation in the machinery of the Third Reich. The inspections documented these women at a Kaufensiv and at a singular moment, the moment of capture, the moment of transition from soldier to prisoner, from citizen of the Reich to stateless detainee. The photographs, medical reports, and interrogation transcripts froze them in time, preserved evidence of who they had been at that instant when one world ended and another, uncertain and frightening, began. In this sense, the inspection served an archival function that transcended their immediate practical purposes. They created a record that would allow future generations to grapple with questions of guilt, responsibility, and the nature of ordinary participation in extraordinary evil. By the summer of 1945, the vast machinery of POW processing was winding down. Women who had been cleared of war crimes allegations and classified as civilian internees were gradually released and repatriated. The camps emptied. The inspection stations closed. American personnel were reassigned to occupation duties or rotated home. The war in Europe was over, and attention shifted to the Pacific Theater, to the beginning of the Cold War, to the enormous task of reconstruction. But the impact of those inspections, of those first encounters between German women prisoners and their American captors, rippled forward in ways both visible and subtle. For the women who experienced them, the inspections became a defining memory, sometimes traumatic, often confusing, occasionally revelatory. Many would carry those memories in silence, would rarely speak of their war service even to family. The shame of defeat, the complexity of reconciling their service with the revealed crimes of the regime, the simple desire to move forward rather than dwell on the past. All of these contributed to a long silence. Yet slowly, over decades, some of those women began to speak. In the 1960s and 70s, as a new generation of Germans began asking questions their parents had avoided, testimonies emerged. Oral history projects recorded the memories of women who had served in Wehrmacht auxiliaries. Academic researchers began piecing together the history of women's military service in the Third Reich, and in these accounts, the moment of capture, the experience of American inspections, appeared again and again as a pivot point, the moment when ideology confronted reality, when propaganda met its contradiction. An elderly woman named Marguerite, interviewed in 1978 for a German university oral history project, described her capture by American forces near Kassel in April 1945. She had been a communications specialist, trained in radio operation, stationed at a Luftwaffe base that was overrun in the final Allied push. "I thought they would shoot us," she said, her voice still carrying the echo of that old fear. Or worse, "We had been told so many terrible things. But they just asked questions, wrote everything down, gave us food." An American nurse examined me. She was very professional, very correct. I remember thinking, this cannot be right. This is not what we were told. It was the beginning of understanding that everything had been lies. Not all testimonies were so clear-cut. Some women remained defensive, insistent that they had done nothing wrong, that their service had been honorable regardless of the regime they served. Others struggled to articulate the complexity of their experiences, the mixture of relief and shame that came with capture, the strange gratitude they felt toward captors, even as they mourned their defeat. The truth, as preserved in these testimonies and in the American records, resists easy summary. It is layered, contradictory, deeply human. In the end, the story of why Americans inspected German women POWs with such care is a story about the collision of systems: ideological, legal, cultural. The Nazi regime had built a state organized around the principles of racial hierarchy, authoritarian control, and the deliberate weaponization of cruelty. It had mobilized women into its military apparatus while maintaining the legal fiction that they were not really soldiers. A cynical manipulation designed to exploit their labor while claiming protection for them under international law. When that system collapsed, the women who had served within it found themselves facing an American military system built on fundamentally different premises, a system that, despite its own flaws and contradictions, operated from baseline assumptions about individual rights, legal procedure, and the importance of documentation, that the inspections were not acts of kindness, though individual acts of kindness occurred within them. They were acts of bureaucracy, of institutional procedure, of a military doctrine that required systematic processing of captured enemy personnel. But the very existence of such procedures, the fact that the Americans approached the problem of German women POWs with regulations and forms and medical examinations rather than with summary violence, revealed a fundamental asymmetry in the conflict, not just an asymmetry of material resources, though that was overwhelming, but an asymmetry of values. This is not to say that American conduct was perfect or that individual instances of misconduct did not occur. War brutalizes, and the American military was not immune to this truth. But the systemic approach, the institutional framework that governed the treatment of POWs, reflected a commitment to principles that the Third Reich had explicitly rejected. And for the German women who experienced this framework firsthand, who were inspected and documented and fed and given medical care by their captors, the experience challenged foundational assumptions about the nature of the conflict and the character of the enemy, the physical objects that passed through the inspection process, the uniforms, the photographs, the personal effects carefully cataloged and stored, became artifacts of this moment of transformation. In museums and archives across America and Germany, these objects now rest in climate-controlled storage, occasionally displayed in exhibitions about the war's end. A visitor to such an exhibition might see a woman's Wehrmacht auxiliary uniform, gray-green wool still creased where it was folded 75 years ago, accompanied by a card noting where and when it was confiscated. Next to it, perhaps, a photograph of the woman who wore it. Taken during the inspection process, her face tired, her eyes uncertain, standing against a white wall while an American photographer documented her capture. These artifacts tell a story, but it is not a simple story. It is not a story of innocent victims or absolute villains. It is a story of ordinary people caught in a historical catastrophe, making choices constrained by circumstances they only partially understood, serving a regime whose true nature many of them failed to fully comprehend until confronted with its ruins. The inspections captured them at that moment of confrontation, preserved evidence of their transformation from believers or at least participants into prisoners, and eventually into citizens of a new Germany that would spend generations grappling with the crimes of the old. The truth, as those inspections documented it, is indeed incredible. Not because it reveals unexpected cruelty, but because it reveals unexpected restraint. In a war that had seen industrial-scale murder, cities reduced to ash, entire populations displaced or destroyed, the Americans maintained procedures for processing captured enemy personnel that acknowledged their basic humanity. This was not mercy, not exactly. It was something perhaps more important. A commitment to principle even in the face of justified rage. A determination to win the war without becoming what they fought against. For the German women, who experienced this commitment firsthand, who were inspected rather than executed, documented rather than disappeared, the implications would unfold over a lifetime. Some would embrace the opportunity to build new lives in a democratic society. Others would retreat into silence or denial. All of them carried forward the memory of that moment when the world they had known ended and they found themselves, against all expectation, treated not as subhumans deserving of extermination, the fate, the regime they had served reserved for its designated enemies, but as prisoners of war entitled to certain minimum standards of treatment. This is what the inspections revealed. In their meticulous documentation and procedural care, a glimpse of a different kind of order. One built not on racial supremacy and arbitrary violence but on law, procedure, and the stubborn insistence that even in war, even toward enemies, certain principles must be maintained. It was an imperfect order, administered by imperfect people. But it offered something the Third Reich never had, the possibility of accountability, of reconstruction, of a future that learned from rather than repeated the past. And so the records remain. Thousands of pages of inspection reports and medical files and interrogation transcripts. Archived proof that at the moment when vengeance would have been easiest, when the crimes of the Nazi regime were being fully revealed, the Americans chose documentation over destruction. They inspected because they believed that law mattered, that evidence mattered, that even enemies possessed certain inalienable rights. In a century that would see many failures of this principle, this moment stands as a testament to what is possible when nations commit, however imperfectly, to fighting for something beyond mere victory, to fighting for a set of values that must be maintained even in the darkest hours, even when every instinct screams for revenge. The German women who stood for those inspections in the winter and spring of 1945 became witnesses to this principle in action. Their testimony, preserved in archives and recovered through decades of historical research, tells us something essential about the nature of that conflict and its resolution. It tells us that wars end not just on battlefields, but in the thousands of small, procedural encounters between victors and vanquished. It tells us that how we treat our enemies in defeat reveals who we truly are. And it tells us that even in the ruins of the worst war in human history, even amid the revelation of crimes almost too vast to comprehend, it remained possible to choose documentation over vengeance, procedure over passion, and the slow work of justice over the immediate satisfaction of revenge. This is the incredible truth. The inspections revealed not a dramatic revelation but a quiet insistence on principle at the moment when principles were hardest to maintain. It was, in its way, as significant a victory as any won on the battlefield.